Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1976 drama film Taxi Driver. Now, Taxi Driver was directed by Martin Scorsese, who prior to this directed films like Boxcar Bertha, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and Mean Streets. And he would go on to direct movies like The King of Comedy, Goodfellas, Casino, the remake of Cape Fear, Gangs of New York, and many others. And the film was written by Schrader, who would go on to work with Scorsese again on films like Raging Bull, The Last Temptation of Christ, which of course was based on the Nikos Kazantzakis novel, and Bringing Out the Dead. And Schrader would actually go on to direct films like Hardcore, American Gigolo, the remake of Cat People, and Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. Now, Taxi Driver is considered by many to be Martin Scorsese's masterpiece, and I definitely think it's one of his masterpieces, which is just a testament to how great of a filmmaker Scorsese is, that he has many films that could qualify as his best film. Now, my personal favorite Scorsese film is Last Temptation of Christ, but Taxi Driver, it is definitely one of Scorsese's best films, and it's also one of his most important films. And it is a very 70s movie. Like, the film definitely reflects the time period that it came out in, yet it's simultaneously a very timeless movie as well, and unfortunately some of the themes in this film are still very much relevant to today's society. And not only is this an amazing crime drama film, but this is also first and foremost a harrowing character study on a psychopath. Now, what the plot of Taxi Driver is, it's about a young man named Travis Bickle, who's a Vietnam War vet who was deeply traumatized by his wartime experiences, but I've always gotten kind of the impression that he already had a lot of these problems even prior to going to the war. So he tries to reacclimate himself to mainstream society, and he gets a job working nights as a taxi driver, but this doesn't seem to help his problems. Actually, it makes his problems even worse, because Travis focuses on the seedier aspects of society, which causes him to hate society as a whole and retreat further into himself, and this self-imposed isolation and loneliness only serves to make him more and more deranged as the movie goes on. And after this relationship with this woman named Betsy falls apart, Travis meets this prostitute named Iris, who he learns from her pimp is only 12 years old. So he makes it his mission, or at least one of his missions, to save this girl from this world and this lifestyle. In the film, Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle, and it's easily one of De Niro's most iconic performances, even though in some ways it's a very non-De Niro performance. What I mean by that is, later in De Niro's career, he kind of became, I don't want to say typecast, but he definitely started to become comfortable in a certain type of role, and looking back on De Niro's entire career, this is kind of a very non-De Niro performance in the sense that, watching the movie, I don't see Robert De Niro, I see Travis Bickle. He becomes Travis Bickle in this movie. And Travis Bickle is a very complicated and complex character, and because the whole movie is told from Travis's perspective, the movie almost tricks you into thinking that you should be on this guy's side. Now yes, Travis is a character that you can feel some sympathy and even empathy for, because he is a man dealing with severe mental illness and most likely PTSD from his experiences in Vietnam. And he's also being driven more and more crazy by his loneliness and isolation, and I think we've all felt the pain of loneliness and alienation and even rejection at some point in our lives. And I feel like what Martin Scorsese and Schrader are saying by getting us to sympathize with Travis is, be careful, because if we're not careful, particularly young adolescent men who have felt a lot of the same feelings that Travis has, if we're not careful, we could become like him. And while you can definitely feel some pity for this character, the movie shows that Travis is not somebody that you should aspire to. Especially because you get the implication from from Travis's monologues and certain scenes in the movie that Travis is kind of a bigot, because there is sort of a subtle undercurrent of racism in the film. It's nothing that's really overt. It is something that you kind of have to be on the lookout for, but it is there. Like, there are certain points in the movie where Travis looks at black people in a very distrusting manner. And also, the first person that Travis ends up killing in the movie is a black man who's robbing a convenience store. Now, that being said, Travis doesn't specifically target black people or minorities in the film. Actually, some of the main people that he ends up going after are white people, but he's going after anybody who he deems as scum, not realizing, or maybe realizing but not admitting it to himself, that he's kind of scum as well. And there's a part towards the beginning of the movie where the character of Betsy, played by Cybill Shepherd, calls Travis a walking contradiction, which at that point she's quoting the Chris Christopherson song, but that line is actually really important because that's exactly what Travis is. Like, Travis claims to be very moralistic, yet you constantly see him going to pornographic films, but what's interesting is when he goes to these movies, it doesn't seem like he's going to them to get any sort of arousal. He's going to them kind of like they're just regular movies, and you almost get the idea that he doesn't know there are any other movies out there besides porno films, because he chooses to see only the seedier parts of the world. Like, you get the idea that he wants to wallow in the muck. He wants to see the world as only this dark, sleazy, seedy place. Like, he only sees the bad in the world, but he kind of wants it that way, but he won't admit that to himself. And in speaking of the character of Betsy, I actually do think had their relationship worked out, she actually might have been able to help Travis and sort of bring him out of this hell that he's created for himself. And it's ironic that he says everybody else is in a hell, when really he's the one in hell, but it's a hell that he totally created for himself. But Travis screws all that up when he takes Betsy on their second date to a porno film, and that scene is meant to show just how socially inept and detached from reality Travis really is. Now, Paul Schrader, when commented on this scene, has said that Travis is not stupid. He knows he shouldn't be taking a date to a movie like that. Basically, Travis wants Betsy to reject him, or he wants to bring her into his world and make her as low as he is. Now, Betsy works at the campaign headquarters for a senator named Charles Palantine who's running for president, and when Betsy rejects Travis, Travis starts plotting on assassinating Palantine, not for any political reasons, but simply to get revenge on Betsy by killing what he believes to be the central male figure in her life. And not only is Travis kind of a racist, but he also definitely has at least a very skewed view on women, and this failed relationship with Betsy doesn't help that at all. And then you have Jodie Foster as the character of Iris, the child prostitute, and this next to her performance as Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs might be her most iconic role, or at least her most famous. Now, of course Iris is a very sympathetic character because, of course, a 12-year-old girl should not even remotely be involved in prostitution, and the scenes where Travis is trying to get her out of this, those are the few scenes in the movie where you actually agree with him. But Jodie Foster gives an outstanding performance in the movie, and I think there was definitely a reason she was nominated for an Oscar at the time, even though her casting in the movie, because she was so young, was actually very controversial. Then you have Harvey Keitel as Iris's pimp, Sport, and he is such a scumbag in this movie, but Harvey Keitel is so charismatic as this character that you actually almost find yourself liking American sport, and you kind of have to check yourself because you almost forget that this guy is a child predator who's sexually exploiting this 12-year-old girl. In the movie, you also have Albert Brooks as Betsy's co-worker Tom. You have Peter Boyle as another taxi driver named Wizard. You also have a very small role from Joe Spinell, who people might recognize from the first two Rocky movies and films like Maniac and The Ninth Configuration, as Travis's boss. And then you have Martin Scorsese making two cameos in the movie. One where he's this guy on a stoop watching Betsy, and another where he's this jealous husband who's ranting to Travis about how he's going to kill his cheating wife. And this is actually a really important scene in the movie, because in this scene, Travis looks disgusted, but you don't know if he's disgusted by this husband who's saying he's going to kill his wife, or if he's disgusted by the wife for cheating on her husband. But the scene is also meant to show that Travis is actually the more dangerous and the more deranged of the two people. Because this character that Martin Scorsese plays could just be blowing off steam and might not actually be planning on killing his wife, whereas this is giving Travis the idea to go down the violent path that he does. But Taxi Driver is a brilliant film, and it's also a film that brilliantly plays the audience because, again, watching this movie, you could be tricked into thinking that Travis Bickle is the hero of the movie. And I remember when I first saw this movie as a teenager, I actually thought the film had a happy ending, because at the end of the movie, he does become a hero. He saves Iris from this child prostitution ring, which is a good thing. But we can't forget that Travis only does this when his plan to assassinate Palantine fails, so he does this as sort of a fallback. So Travis is not doing it for Iris, he's doing it for himself, because he has sort of a hero complex, or he basically wants to be something, and he doesn't care whether he ends up being a villain or a hero. He just wants to be something, and he wants to be remembered for something. And even by the end of the film, he's still dangerously deranged. But yeah, Taxi Driver is an excellent movie and easily one of Scorsese's best films. Lastly, I do gotta mention Bernard Herrmann's score for the movie, which has a real old Hollywood feel, which is an interesting contrast where you have all this violence and sleaze on the screen, yet the music is so classy. Now, with how dark and almost nihilistic that this movie is, I'm actually relatively surprised that pop culture latched onto this movie as much as it did. Like, the line, "you talking to me," has become so ingrained in popular culture that I've heard that line quoted long before I ever even heard of this movie. Like, I specifically remember an episode of Hey Arnold that spoofed that line, and the scene where Travis says that line. Even the convenience store robbery scene, I've seen that scene ripped off in several other movies. You could also see the influence of Taxi Driver on movies like Abel Ferrara's Driller Killer, a movie like The Last Horror Film, which ironically also had Joe Spinell in it, and actually that movie was kind of loosely based on the whole John Hinckley incident, which I will talk about in a second. There was also a 1984 film called Combat Shock, which had a real Taxi Driver feel to it. Actually, that movie kind of felt like a hybrid between Taxi Driver and Eraserhead. And the recent Todd Phillips film Joker owes a lot to Taxi Driver. And there's so many little callbacks to this movie in pop culture. Like, I remember in Robert Rodriguez's Machete, Robert De Niro plays one of the villains, and there's a scene where Robert De Niro's character actually has to drive around in a taxi cab, and that was an obvious nod to this movie. The punk band Rancid has a song called Travis Bickle, and Henry Rollins did a song called Disconnect, and the music video for that song is quite quite clearly based on Taxi Driver, and in that video, Henry Rollins plays a Travis Bickle-like character. You can even see the influence of Taxi Driver in something like Alan Moore's groundbreaking graphic novel Watchmen, because honestly, there are a lot of similarities between Rorschach and Travis Bickle. Now, an unfortunate part of this movie's legacy is, of course, John Hinckley Jr., who became obsessed with Jodie Foster from this movie and ended up stalking her, and he actually tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan as a way to impress her. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to some friends of mine giving their thoughts on Taxi Driver.
Hi everyone. Christian has generously asked me to share my thoughts on Taxi Driver. Well, Taxi Driver is one of my all-time favorite films. To give a little historical context, I first saw Taxi Driver when I was 15 or 16. And at this time in the 80s, it was taken as gospel that the John Hughes teen films accurately reflected the experiences and angst of teenagers growing up in the 80s. I hated and still hate the John Hughes films. The petty problems of the rich, privileged jerks in his films reflected nothing of my life. Maybe this says too much about my teenage years, but I identified much more with the alienation, detachment, and confusion of Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver is a film I have returned to countless times because it reflects the existential search for meaning in a meaningless world, which I think is still apropos now. The acting in the film, of course, is phenomenal, right? Robert De Niro's performance is iconic and has actually become part of pop culture, right? Whenever anyone does a De Niro imitation, you have to say, "You talking to me?" Jodie Foster, Albert Brooks, Peter Boyle are all amazing too. But for me, Harvey Keitel steals every scene he's in. He's so funny, but also he's like the biggest dirtbag in a total sea of filth. When he tells Travis to go back to his tribe, I always crack up at that part. Martin Scorsese's direction is masterful, right? He turns New York City into a main character in the film. The city is hell on earth, with steam bellowing through the streets and Travis driving his little yellow coffin through Hades. It's also the little touches in the film that make it so memorable. The scene where Travis stares at the Alka-Seltzer in the glass as it like bubbles and erupts obviously is a reflection of his own psyche, what he's going through. When he calls Betsy to apologize and the camera moves off of him and peers down like an empty hallway, right? This, of course, showing his isolation, right? His total sort of alienation and isolation. There's the part when he's in his apartment and he's like, pointing the gun at the TV, and then he tips the TV over with his foot, right? Which is just like this amazing metaphor for his mind, which is just on the brink, right? Just tottering into chaos. The training sessions when he burns his arm on the stove, right? As if he's trying to like purify himself. It's almost like he's like this martyr or this Catholic martyr or a kamikaze pilot before his self-destructive mission. The end, of course, is just unbelievable. It's just an amazing ending. I interpret the ending as Travis's dying fantasy because it just seems too perfect, right? Everything just sort of perfectly lines up for him. For me, the real ending of the movie is when the camera pans up above Travis as he's like bleeding on the couch and the cops come in, right? And then the camera sort of like hovers through the scenes of death and destruction, sort of moves out into the street. It's almost like Travis's soul is like leaving this mortal coil and going out into the sky. Although I think Scorsese's best films are Last Temptation of Christ and Raging Bull, which, if you think about it, are two more films about flawed protagonists pursuing an ideal. My favorite Scorsese film is Taxi Driver because its loneliness and isolation still speaks to me after all these years.
Taxi Driver is one of those films that is just as relevant today as it was back in the 70s. It's a character study about one of these guys who goes through society feeling like a nothing and wants to be somebody by using a gun. And as we all know, there were a lot of these guys popping up in the 60s and 70s. Lonely assassins who were absolute nobodies who became somebodies by assassinating a political figure like John F. Kennedy, a civil rights leader like Martin Luther King Jr., or a celebrity like John Lennon. And today, these guys are still around, but they've moved on to causing mass destruction in schools and malls and churches, and join online movements like the incel movement. What Taxi Driver does is take one of these douchebags and lets you see through his eyes. Robert De Niro's character, Travis Bickle, is a very troubled individual, and I love how De Niro portrays him. He makes you look at Bickle as a sympathetic character, but also adds enough disturbing details to keep reminding you that this is not someone you should look up to, but someone who you can look at and feel pity for. It's not all De Niro, of course. It's also Scorsese, Scorsese is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, and it's not just because he is an artist who knows how to tell a story, but also because he has the guts to tell the truth to his art. Not one detail is shied away from. Not one subject matter is ignored because it may be too shocking for viewers or the censors. Now yes, I get it. He isn't going full Marquis de Sade, my personal literary hero, but he does talk about things that the other people, other creators and stuff may shy away from. For example, in this movie, Jodie Foster is a little girl who is also a prostitute, and when she goes up to a room with Bickle, not only are you afraid that what you're about to see may get you put on the FBI watch list, but the way her character is so free with sexuality, despite being so young, makes you feel just as bad for her as you do Bickle, because you realize that it's society that has placed them in this situation, and that they didn't have much control over their circumstances. The relationship they share is very fun to watch. You watch two people get to know each other and become friends, and I won't spoil anything, but it gets to the point that someone is willing to kill for the other, and it's a pretty amazing scene. Which brings me to the violence. Now, this isn't a Tarantino film, nor is this Goodfellas, but it does get violent at parts, and if you are squeamish about blood, I would say, just proceed with caution. But when I say it's not enough to make you walk out, I really mean it. It's only a small part of the film. The film is so much more than violence and gore. It's a great story, writing is top-notch, acting, as I mentioned before, is astonishing. From the main characters like De Niro, Foster, and Harvey Keitel, down to the little side characters. There is a scene with a man who gets into the taxi with Bickle, and I won't spoil anything again, but if you know what was going on at the time, and you see that this guy is just as or even more disturbing than Bickle, then you'll be able to put two and two together and figure out who he's supposed to be. And that actor is fantastic. The pacing, it's a slow movie, not an action thriller or anything like that, and it is quite long, but it never gets boring. Don't get me wrong. In fact, every time I watch the movie, it just flies by. If I had a list of my favorite Scorsese films, this one would be number 2, right under Goodfellas. There was a time when I would have said number 3, but then I realized that Scorsese wasn't going to direct Joker, so, I had to change my list. But yeah, I recommend this movie to everyone interested in the art of film. And anyone who has seen this film, go ahead and watch it again. Might as well enjoy Taxi Driver one more time, don't you think?
Taxi Driver is definitely one of Martin Scorsese's best films. It's a very intriguing story of a lonely man named Travis Bickle who descends into madness while also showing his inner thoughts and what his motivations are. Travis drives a taxi through New York City, which is presented as a real sleazy, morally bankrupt place full of prostitutes and all kinds of lowlifes. I like how Travis is trying to find someone decent in this cesspool of a city, and he thinks that he finds it in Betsy, played by Cybill Shepherd, and Iris, played by Jodie Foster. I must say, Robert De Niro gives one of his best performances in this movie. He's so intense and on edge, and yet, in a way, he also makes you feel sorry for him. Travis clearly doesn't have the best social skills, and yet he tries to start a relationship with Betsy, which ends in disaster after he takes her to see a pornographic movie. I always feel a sense of devastation when the date goes badly, because you know that it just feeds into his deterioration. You definitely feel this character's pain and how lonely he is, and it's just painful to watch his downward spiral. I think a lot of what this movie is about is loneliness and what it can do to a person. One scene that stuck out to me in particular is when Travis tries to confide in one of his fellow taxi drivers named Wizard, played by Peter Boyle, about his bad thoughts, and, Wizard just kind of dismisses him by saying that he'll be fine. To me, that shows that Travis isn't just some one-dimensional psychopath. He's a person desperately trying to get help in any way he can, and when he doesn't get it, that only fuels his descent into violence. Jodie Foster also does a great job as Iris, the child prostitute that Travis tries to help. She's so innocent, and you get the sense that her home life wasn't so great, which is why she ran away, and now she's stuck with an abusive pimp played very well by Harvey Keitel. The guy is so sleazy, like when he's describing all the sexual things Travis can do to Iris, it's like, oh my God, you're talking about a 12-year-old girl! I think the way Harvey Keitel moves in the scene is really good, as well as the way he says his dialogue. He's constantly moving his hands, and sometimes in a sarcastic, joking way that makes it seem like he's trying to lighten the mood. So he's a scumbag who likes to kid around. Another great scene is the one in the diner when Travis tries to convince Iris to go back home. I like Travis's almost parental-like concern for her, and how, as Travis is saying, that she shouldn't be selling her body to a bunch of lowlifes. She tries to defend what she's doing, even though, to me, her body language kind of signifies that deep down she knows that he's right. I also thought that the scene in which Travis is forced to listen to a jealous, angry man, played by Martin Scorsese, about how he's going to kill his cheating wife, was very good. It just goes to further show the kind of lowlifes that infest the city that drive Travis to violence. I think Martin Scorsese is very good in his brief cameo, and of course he also did a great job directing this film. I had the great pleasure of meeting him back in 2014, and it was an amazing experience. Of course, how could I talk about this movie without mentioning the iconic "You talking to me" scene? To me, it's the scene that shows that Travis has finally lost all his patience for society, and the ticking time bomb inside him is just ready to go off. The way he handles the gun and practices whipping it out is very intense, as is the scene that shows his rigorous workout routine. I gotta say, hearing the sound of him cocking the gun while he talks to himself is very unnerving, because it just shows the damaging effect that his loneliness and resentment of how low the city has sunk has had on him. It's just a very haunting scene, and probably the most iconic one in the movie. I also want to mention Bernard Herrmann's amazing musical score, as it would just be a crime not to talk about that. It's so perfectly downbeat and depressing, and it just fits the tone of the movie so well. It's definitely best used during the scenes in which Travis is driving in his cab alone at night and looking out into the mess that is New York City. It's just a perfect blend of scene and music, and it just complements the film so well. Well, I think I'll wrap up here. I hope you've all enjoyed my review. Take care and stay safe.
Hello everyone. Christian asked me what my thoughts and opinions are on the movie Taxi Driver. First off, I just want to say how I think it's Martin Scorsese's masterpiece, among there with Goodfellas, and how that's one of the greatest films ever of all time, despite how very controversial it is among moviegoers to this day. Taxi Driver is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a film that really defines New York City back in the 1970s, how crime rates were very high for that time, and how that living in New York City for that time was not really a safe place to be. Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle is fantastic. He's a character that's weird, crazy, sick, mentally ill, and yet there are times in the movie he's likable. He's not likable when he takes Nancy to the porn theater, because it shows how he is out of touch with reality. When he tries to save Iris, the 12-year-old prostitute, that's what makes him very likable. Harvey Keitel's character as Sport is very sickening. In the end, he definitely gets what he deserves. The shootout scene, it's one of the most brutal, violent gore scenes filmed ever, especially for that time, when gore was becoming a new thing in film and violence. It's interesting how rewatching this movie throughout the years and hearing other people's point of view, it never occurred to me that this was all in Travis' head, or personally in my opinion, it was real. When you think about it, they do give hints at times, but at the same time, it still makes you question and wonder if this was really all in Travis' head or not. You Talking to Me is probably one of the greatest lines ever in the history of cinema. Even for people who have not seen this movie, they've heard that line so many times with like parodies and like The Simpsons or SCTV, Animaniacs, etc. The list goes on and on for the list of parodies. So that was my review on Taxi Driver. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and thank you, Christian, for asking me my thoughts and opinions on Taxi Driver.
So, I hope you enjoyed my friend's short reviews on this movie, but that was my review on Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, and bye.